Every morning, without fail, the old German shepherd sat in the same spot, just outside the rusted black gate of St. Mark's Veterans Hospital. He arrived at dawn, well before the staff shift began, and curled up against the short brick wall that bordered the parking lot, always facing the same direction, the hospital's main entrance. He didn't beg, bark, or chase anyone. He simply waited. His graying fur and cloudy eyes told of many winters past, yet his posture remained firm, attentive, hopeful. The nurses named him Ranger. No one remembered when exactly he started showing up. Some said 5 years ago, others said 7. But the earliest mention in hospital logs was nearly a decade prior. Someone had tried to call animal control once, thinking he was a stray, but the vet that examined him found a chip, registered under a Thomas E. Baylor, a former Army medic listed as missing in action since 2013. That discovery stirred whispers among the staff, rumors that perhaps the dog was waiting for someone long gone. Ranger became a fixture outside the hospital. Volunteers brought him food and water, and even an old dog bed. One orderly, Marcus, made it his daily ritual to talk to Ranger before and after his shift. "Morning, General," he'd say with a salute. "Still standing guard, huh?" The dog would thump his tail once in acknowledgement. It was all part of the quiet rhythm of the hospital. But to Ranger, it was more than routine. It was purpose. Every morning, he scanned every pair of boots, every face, every wheelchair and uniform that came through the entrance. And every night, when the sun dipped below the trees lining the street, he would get up, stretch slowly, and limp off down the road toward the wooded edge of the city. No one knew where he went, but by morning he was back. One autumn day, a young reporter named Ellie Park visited St. Mark's for a human interest piece. She was covering the hospital's veteran mural project, but her attention quickly drifted to the aging dog lying quietly by the gate. "What's his story?" she asked a nurse. "That's Ranger," the nurse replied. "He's been waiting here longer than I've worked here. People say he's waiting for his owner, a soldier that never came back." Ellie, who had grown up on stories about military loyalty and the bond between soldiers and their service dogs, felt a tug at her chest. She sat near Ranger for a few minutes, took a few photos, and jotted down some notes. What started as a passing curiosity quickly turned into an obsession. She dug into local records, contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs, and even spoke with retired hospital staff. Slowly, a narrative began to emerge. Thomas Baylor had served in Afghanistan in 2012, a combat medic with a record of bravery and calm under fire. His unit had come under attack in a remote mountain pass. After tending to a wounded comrade, Thomas went missing. His dog, Ranger, had been left stateside, reportedly with Thomas's brother. But within months, Ranger had escaped and couldn't be found. A year later, he appeared outside St. Mark's. No one could explain how he got there or why he stayed. Ellie's article, "The Dog That Waits," went viral within a week. Pictures of Ranger staring at the hospital doors tugged at millions of hearts. Veterans from around the country commented on the story. "That dog knows," wrote one. "They always do." Donations poured in. Ranger received a custom shelter by the hospital wall, vet visits, and even letters addressed to him. One letter read, "Dear Ranger, you're a hero too." The hospital staff set up a small plaque beside his bed, in honor of loyalty. But even as the world learned his story, Ranger's routine didn't change. He waited. Every day. Same spot. Same time. Through snow, rain, and summer heat, the city knew his silhouette now. Taxi drivers would slow down as they passed. School children waved. He was more than a dog. He was a symbol. But what no one could explain, what even Ellie couldn't understand, was why Ranger had chosen this hospital. Thomas Baylor had never been a patient at St. Mark's. According to military records, he had served in another state, and his unit had been based hundreds of miles away. Ranger's chip showed a different address entirely. The logic didn't add up. The heart, however, believed. 10 years is a long time to wait. Long enough for hope to fade in most people, but not in a dog, and certainly not in Ranger. He was slower now, the limp in his hind leg more noticeable. But his eyes still flicked toward every pair of boots that stepped past the gate. And though he'd grown used to the looks of sympathy, to the cameras, to the letters and attention, there was only one thing he was truly waiting for. And he hadn't come yet. The seasons shifted again. Winter came slowly, blanketing the city in a pale stillness, the kind that muffled car horns and made the air hum with silence. Snow piled softly along the sidewalks outside St. Mark's Veterans Hospital, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Ranger, now visibly older, thinner, and moving with the stiff weight of time, continued his vigil. The staff had added a heated pad inside his small shelter. Children began leaving scarves, tiny American flags, and notes tucked inside plastic sleeves beside him. "Come home, soldier," one read. "He's still waiting." The hospital director, Mr. Levitt, who had at first been skeptical of the media attention, now greeted Ranger each morning with a soft pat and a whisper, "Still here, buddy." Ranger would thump his tail once, eyes still fixed on the hospital entrance. Meanwhile, Ellie Park couldn't let the mystery go. Her article had launched a national conversation about loyalty, memory, and the cost of war. But for her, it wasn't just a story anymore. It was personal. She spent evenings combing through archives, tracing Thomas Baylor's movements, interviewing surviving members of his unit, even flying out to Colorado to speak with a man named Joel Briggs, one of the last people to see Thomas alive. "We thought he died," Joel said quietly, holding a mug with both hands. There was a lot of gunfire, then an explosion. He went back to help someone, and he never came out. We waited, but we couldn't stay. We had to pull out. Ellie nodded slowly. "Did he ever mention St. Mark's?" Joel looked up. He had family in this state, I think. But he never mentioned a hospital. Back in the city, Ranger began coughing. The vet said it was age, maybe a weak heart. Still, the dog showed up every single day. Ellie returned to the hospital one frozen January morning, watching Ranger from across the street. Something tugged at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She followed him at sunset, keeping her distance as he limped away from the hospital, weaving through alleyways and quiet streets until he reached the edge of the city, near a rundown warehouse. There, among old crates and broken pallets, was a weathered sleeping mat and a tin bowl. Ranger's nest. Ellie stepped forward slowly, crouched down. "This is where you go," she whispered. Ranger didn't flinch. He just looked at her with those tired eyes, then turned his head toward the warehouse wall, where someone had spray-painted a faded symbol, a military unit insignia. Her breath caught. That wasn't a coincidence. She took a photo and left quietly. Days later, a letter arrived at St. Mark's. It was addressed to "Whoever knows the dog by the gate." Inside was a weather-stained note and a hospital bracelet from a clinic in a small town across the country. The handwriting was shaky. "I saw the article," it read. "If this is real, if that's really Ranger, I need to come. My name is Thomas E. Baylor." The return address was barely legible. The staff thought it was a prank. But Ellie didn't. She got in touch with the clinic listed on the bracelet. They confirmed. Thomas Baylor had been admitted 6 months ago under the name Tom Barron. He had been living in a homeless shelter, suffering from partial amnesia and PTSD. His fingerprints had never been cross-referenced with military databases. Until Ellie called. Within days, the news exploded again. "Veteran found after 10 years missing." But Ranger didn't care about headlines. He just kept waiting. Ellie flew out with a volunteer from the hospital and a representative from Veterans Affairs. When they found Thomas, he was thinner than his photos, his beard grown wild, eyes sunken. But when they showed him the latest photo of Ranger, his hand trembled. "He's alive," he whispered. "He waited." They didn't need to convince him. He packed the next morning. The hospital made preparations. Staff and patients buzzed with excitement. Reporters lined up outside. But they didn't tell Ranger anything. They wanted it to be real. No rehearsals, no stage, just the gate, the dog, and the man. The day Thomas arrived was cold, but bright. The sun cast long shadows across the front steps of the hospital. Ranger was already there, lying beside his small shelter, eyes trained on the entrance. Thomas stepped out of the black SUV and stood still. The world paused. For a moment, there was no noise, just wind, breath, and space between them. Then Ranger lifted his head. He stared, sniffed the air. Thomas took a step forward, then another. "Hey, boy," he said, his voice cracking. "Hey, Ranger." The dog stood slowly, uncertain. He tilted his head, then, with a sudden jarring motion, bolted. It wasn't fast, not like before, but it was determined. He ran to the gate, pushing his nose through the bars, whining. Thomas knelt down, pressing his hand to the metal. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm sorry I took so long." Ranger licked his fingers, then whimpered again. The staff opened the gate. The reunion was quiet. No music, no crowd noise. Just the sound of a tail beating the ground and a man crying into his dog's fur. No one dared interrupt. Even the cameras stayed back. Thomas didn't need to say anything. The snow had melted by the time Thomas Baylor officially returned to the city where Ranger had waited for him all those years. The hospital offered him a room for as long as he needed, and Ellie helped set up a local outreach fund to support his reintegration into civilian life. But Thomas didn't care much for attention or money or speeches. He had missed too many years already. The only thing he wanted now was time. Time to walk beside his dog. Time to sit without fear. Time to breathe without flinching. Ranger was never more than a few feet away. The moment they were reunited, he followed Thomas everywhere, from the cafeteria to the hospital courtyard, even into physical therapy. The doctors were amazed by Thomas's recovery. His memory, though patchy, was improving. The trauma still lived in his eyes, but the emptiness had begun to fade. Ranger had filled it without saying a word. One afternoon, Ellie visited with her notepad in hand, but this time she wasn't writing an article. She just wanted to see them. Thomas was seated on a bench outside, Ranger lying at his feet, sun warming their backs. "Do you remember everything now?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, the wind tugging gently at his silvered hair. "Not everything," he admitted. "Some things are gone forever. But the important pieces, I think they've found their way back." Ellie nodded and looked at Ranger. He knew, all this time. "Yeah," Thomas whispered, reaching down to scratch Ranger's ear. He never gave up, not even once. Weeks turned into months. Spring colored the trees and filled the hospital garden with blooming tulips. People still came by to meet the dog that waited. But now they saw a different picture, not one of longing and loss, but one of reunion and grace. Thomas started volunteering at the hospital, talking to younger veterans who had just returned from overseas. Many were broken in invisible ways, and when words failed, he simply brought Ranger into the room and let silence do the healing. Ranger, despite his age, seemed renewed by purpose. His legs were still weak, his fur more gray than gold, but his eyes gleamed with life again. He even played fetch once or twice, though he quickly tired. Thomas laughed when Ranger lay on his back afterward, tongue lolling out, eyes half closed with happiness. "You're not a pup anymore," he'd tease, "but you're still my soldier." One night, Thomas sat alone in his hospital room. Ranger slept curled up beside the bed. On the table sat a stack of letters, notes from strangers, fellow soldiers, children who had read about them in school. One letter, however, was different. It was from a woman named Carol, who claimed to be Thomas's younger sister. He hadn't seen her in 30 years. She thought he'd died. The letter was simple. "If you're really back, I would love to see you. I've missed you every day." He stared at the letter a long time, unsure how to respond. He hadn't just disappeared from a battlefield. He had vanished from the lives of everyone who loved him. The weight of that realization sat heavy on his chest. Ranger stirred in his sleep, pressing his head against Thomas's foot, as if to remind him, "You're not alone anymore." The next day, Ellie offered to drive him. The reunion was quiet. Carol lived in a small farmhouse outside the city. She opened the door slowly, eyes wide, hand trembling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped forward, tears running down her cheeks, and hugged him so tightly he thought he might break. "You're home," she whispered. "You're really home." Ranger barked softly, tail wagging as if to confirm it. That summer, Thomas and Ranger settled into a small house not far from the hospital. They spent their days walking short distances through the park, sitting by the pond, and listening to the laughter of kids chasing kites. Sometimes Thomas would speak at veteran events. He never talked about combat. He talked about loyalty, about silence, about waiting. My dog never stopped believing, he'd say, even when the whole world moved on. He waited because he knew I wasn't finished yet. Time, however, remains undefeated. Ranger's health declined. He slept more, moved less. Thomas stayed with him every night, sleeping beside his bed on the floor, whispering stories into the dog's ears. When the end came, it was quiet. Just before dawn, Ranger took one last breath, his head resting on Thomas's boot. Thomas didn't cry. He simply held his old friend close and whispered, "You waited for me. I'll wait for you now." Ranger was buried on a quiet hill just behind the house. A small stone marked the spot. Ranger, he waited. People came, left flowers, medals, even notes. Ellie wrote a final story. Not a viral sensation this time, but a tribute. Not every hero wears a uniform, she wrote. Some wear fur and wait by the gate. Years later, when Thomas himself passed away, his sister found a letter tucked into his desk drawer. It was addressed to Ranger. "I hope I did right by you. I hope I gave you the life you deserved. Thank you for finding me, for saving me, for waiting." They buried him beside Ranger, beneath the same tree where they used to sit. And if you visit that hill in spring, you might see children running past, stopping to read the stones and whispering the story to each other. They say, a man once came back from nowhere because a dog believed he would. And every year, on the day of Ranger's passing, someone leaves a single boot and a leash at the gate of St. Mark's Hospital. No one knows who. But those who understand smile quietly and nod. Some loyalty never dies.